You know, when we think about the greatest heists in human history, our minds usually gravitate toward, well, the cinematic stuff.
Right, like bank vaults or art thieves.
Exactly. Art thieves, scaling museum walls, or I don't know, maybe some sophisticated hackers draining billions from a crypto exchange.
Yeah, we instinctively think about the theft of physical, tangible things,
Mm-hmm.
assets you can just, put in a bag or quantify on a balance sheet.
Right. Gold, diamonds, or even territorial land. But the stack of research we are looking at today for this deep dive, it frames a heist on a scale that fundamentally breaks our normal understanding of theft.
It really does, because while physical resources were absolutely plundered, this was about stealing something infinitely more valuable.
And infinitely more difficult to replace.
Exactly. It was the literal hijacking of an entire continent's natural historical evolution. I mean, it was the theft of time itself.
The theft of time, that's wow.
Yeah. Pressing pause on the organic development of millions of people across all these diverse societies for nearly a century.
Which is a profound way to look at the data.
It is. And honestly, as we dig into the economic models today, it might actually be the only mathematically accurate way to measure what really happened.
So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are attempting to solve what might be the ultimate historical murder mystery, centered around a question that has um, baffled, divided, and frankly enraged people for generations.
And that question is a massive paradox.
Right. Why is the continent with arguably the most extreme abundance of mineral and natural wealth on the planet still burdened by the highest proportion of extreme global poverty?
To get to the bottom of that, we are leaning heavily on a landmark working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Yeah, the NBER.
Right. It's by economists Leander Heldring and James A. Robinson, and it's titled Colonialism and Economic Development in Africa.
And what they've done here is synthesize a truly massive mountain of data. Economic, historical, anthropological.
Yeah, they aren't just looking at what happened in a textbook sense. They are measuring the structural impact of those events using very modern economic tools.
And before we get into the numbers, I want to be really clear with you listening right now. We are dealing with European colonialism in Africa today.
Which is obviously a very heavy topic.
Very heavy. It touches on intensely political, deeply emotional, and often very painful ideologies.
You have fiercely anti-imperialist Marxist views on one end of the spectrum, and then, staunch, unapologetic defenders of the British and French empires on the other.
But our mission today is strictly impartial. We are not here to take a political side, push an ideology, or deliver a moral lecture to you.
We're basically putting on our detective hats.
Exactly. We are going to examine the raw data, the historical records, the wage charts, and the economic formulas, and just follow the evidence wherever it leads.
We are looking past the surface-level historical narratives that usually dominate the conversation. The goal is to find the hidden structural damage.
The invisible architecture, right?
Yeah, this invisible architecture that was built over a century ago, but which still heavily dictates the flow of global capital and inequality today.
It's going to be a heavy and frankly a fascinating journey. But to understand the crime, we first have to look at the alibi.
The historical cover story.
Right. A cover story that, bizarrely enough, almost everyone at the time agreed upon. Let's start with a really weird historical puzzle.
Okay.
Think about the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Why did Karl Marx's most fervent radical followers and the most ruthless, stiff upper lip British colonial governors agree on exactly one thing?
It is genuinely one of the strangest alliances in modern intellectual history.
Yeah.
We naturally assume that the far left and the far right have always fundamentally violently disagreed on the concept of European imperialism.
Right, you'd think they would be complete opposites.
But when it came to Africa at the end of the 19th century, they shared a remarkably unified worldview.
They shared this incredible, arrogant delusion, which formed the absolute justification for the entire scramble for Africa. Let's look at the Marxist side first.
Yeah, the paper highlights scholars like Bill Warren writing much later in 1980, but tracing back to Lenin's earlier views.
And what did they believe?
They essentially believed that imperialism, as brutal and exploitative as it obviously was a necessary evil for Africa.
A necessary evil. Wow.
Yeah, because the Marxist historical theory relies on stages of development, right? Feudalism gives way to capitalism, which eventually gives way to socialism.
So to them, late 19th century Africa was just, what, backward?
Exactly. They saw it's pre-capitalist. They argued that European invasion, by forcing the introduction of wage labor, private property, and industrial infrastructure, was dragging the continent closer to capitalism.
So in their strictly theoretical view, you literally needed the trauma of capitalist imperialism as an evolutionary stepping stone.
Right. The radical left thought, it's ugly, but it's accelerating history.
Which is wild. And then you flip to the completely opposite end of the political spectrum. You have the colonial administrators themselves.
The people actually drawing the borders.
Yeah, the ones enforcing the laws. The paper references Alan McPhee, a British academic writing in 1926. He argued that the colonial powers were unleashing an economic revolution in British West Africa.
And Frederick Lugard, one of the most famous British colonial administrators, called it the dual mandate.
Right. The idea that Europe was benefiting from the resources, but Africa was equally benefiting from the introduction of civilization.
They truly believed they were the saviors bringing light to the darkness.
So you have the radical left viewing it as a necessary economic catalyst, and the imperialists viewing it as a benevolent humanitarian revolution.
But what's fascinating is looking at why this consensus existed.
Yeah.
Why did two completely opposed worldviews land on the exact same justification?
Yeah, why?
The paper points out is because both sides lacked what economists call a counterfactual.
A counterfactual. Let's explain that.
It's a foundational tool in economics and history. It's basically the process of asking what would have happened otherwise.
Right. To measure the impact of an event, you have to compare the actual outcome to the hypothetical scenario where the event never occurred.
Exactly. Both the Marxists and the colonial governors simply assumed that without European intervention, Africa would have remained entirely static.
Just frozen in amber forever.
Right. They looked at the continent in 1885, noted the lack of European-style steam engines or specific financial institutions, and concluded that Africa would never develop those things unless forced to at gunpoint.
And this brings us to a really common modern defense of colonialism. Because if you look at the raw GDP data, much of it reconstructed by the famous economic historian Angus Maddison, GDP per capita did technically rise from the baseline of 1885.
It did. During the colonial period, it was a slow, very modest growth, but the lines on the graph generally point upward.
And I can hear the defenders of the empire right now saying, look at the chart. The line went up. We built railways. We built ports. We introduced new agricultural techniques. That is an economic revolution.
That is the core of the argument. But it relies on a massive logical fallacy.
How so?
The presence of new technology does not prove that the colonizers were the only ones who could have introduced it. It assumes a total lack of African agency.
Like the societies there were completely incapable of adopting global technology on their own.
Right. It's a bizarre assumption.
I like to think of it like this. Imagine I break into your house, smash your windows, take your savings, but while I'm there, I install a high-speed Wi-Fi router.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Then I point to your faster internet speeds as proof that without my home invasion, you would have been using dial-up for the rest of your life.
That perfectly captures the dynamic. It confuses the delivery method of the technology with the invention itself.
Exactly. And the historical record backs up your analogy. Global technology diffuses organically. It always has.
The paper points out that even without the violent military campaigns of the scramble for Africa, missionaries were already fanning out across the continent, spreading literacy.
Global trade was naturally expanding anyway.
Yeah. And later in the 20th century, the World Health Organization and international NGOs disseminated medical tech worldwide, reaching countries regardless of whether they were formal colonies or not.
Which means we have to actually explore that ultimate counterfactual. We have to enter the parallel universe.
The what-if scenario.
Yeah. If the 1885 Berlin Conference never happened, if the major European powers didn't sit around a big table with a map and carve up the continent with literal rulers, would Africa be richer today?
To answer that, we have to look closely at what Africa actually looked like right before that conference.
Because the prevailing myth, the historical cover story, is that it was a dark, primitive landscape waiting to be discovered and organized.
But the data paints a completely different picture. It was actively centralizing. It was building its own infrastructure.
Let's look at the actual uncolonized nations of the era as our control group.
Yes, if we want to know what an uncolonized Africa might have done, we look at non-European countries that maintain their sovereignty. Look at Thailand or Iran or even Japan.
They were never formally colonized by Europeans.
And yet they modernized independently. In Thailand, King Chulalongkorn initiated massive bureaucratic and infrastructural reforms in the late 19th century.
They adopted new technologies, centralized their states, and integrated into global markets.
They didn't need a foreign governor stationed in their capital to explain how a steam engine works. They bought them, reverse engineered them, or hired consultants.
And when we look at the data for pre-1885 Africa, we see the exact same organic processes already underway.
The Heldring and Robinson paper highlights several incredible examples that really dismantle the static Africa myth. Look at the Asante state in what is now Ghana, or the Buganda state in modern-day Uganda.
Let's focus on the Asante state for a second, because the details of their governance are striking. They weren't just wandering tribes, they were building a sophisticated nation-state.
They were actively bureaucratizing. By the 19th century, the Asante state was undergoing a process of political centralization that historians directly compare to the bureaucratization of European states in the early modern period.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they were systematically replacing local, hereditary clan leaders with appointed officials based on merit and loyalty, often referred to as the king's men.
Wait, so they were building a civil service?
They were. And physically, they were building extensive, maintained road networks radiating out from the capital, Kumasi, to facilitate trade, communication, and military movement.
And they had complex tax systems, too.
Exactly. And the Kuba state in Central Africa is another brilliant example.
What were they doing?
The research shows they had independently invented a complex legal system that included the concept of trial by a jury of one's peers.
Are you serious? Trial by jury?
Yes, they had designated judges, mechanisms for gathering evidence, and structured conflict resolution.
That completely shatters the narrative.
It does. The 19th century in West Africa, leading right up to the Berlin Conference, is often referred to by economic historians as the period of legitimate commerce.
Following the gradual end of the Atlantic slave trade, right?
Exactly. There was massive commercial dynamism. Africa was heavily participating in global trade, exporting palm oil, peanuts, cola nuts. They were responding to global market incentives, adopting new crops, and expanding production.
So the evolutionary path was already paved, and African societies were actively walking down it. They were, taking driving lessons, figuring out the mechanics of modern statehood.
And then 1885 happens. The colonizers hijacked the steering wheel.
So what happens next?
The damage inflicted wasn't uniform across the continent. This is where Heldring and Robinson's methodology shines. They categorized the colonies into 3 distinct types to understand the specific, localized mechanisms of destruction.
Let's start with what they call Type 1 colonies.
Right.
The Type 1 colonies were the ones that actually had those centralized states we just talked about, the advanced ones, the Asante in Ghana, the Tswana states in Botswana.
And here is where the data reveals something incredibly dark.
Yeah, this is a real slap in the face to common sense. Having a strong, organized, advanced society didn't protect these nations from the colonizers.
Not at all.
It actually made them the perfect targets for a very specific, deeply structural kind of corruption.
It is a tragedy of efficiency. You have to look at the incentives of the colonizers, particularly the British. They were running a global empire on a budget.
They didn't want to spend a fortune building new governments, courts, and tax collection agencies from scratch in the African interior.
Right. When they arrived in these centralized states, they found these sophisticated existing political hierarchies, and they realized they could co-opt them.
So they didn't build governments, they weaponized the existing ones.
Exactly. They instituted a policy known as indirect rule. The logic was simple. It is much cheaper to rule through the existing local chiefs than to ship over thousands of British civil servants.
But in doing so, they fundamentally mutated the nature of that local leadership.
They absolutely did.
I want to dig into that mutation, because on paper, if I'm reading a textbook, leaving the local chief in charge sounds less intrusive. It almost sounds like they are preserving local culture. How did indirect rule actually damage these societies?
It sounds benign, but it was a fatal severance of political accountability.
How so?
Well, before colonization, African political systems, even the centralized ones with kings or powerful chiefs, were often quite fluid and heavily reliant on consent.
A chief had power, yes, but there were traditional mechanisms to check that power.
Right. The Asante had specific rituals for de-stooling a chief, literally removing them from the ceremonial stool of power if they became tyrannical or failed to provide for the community.
So they had to answer to their local constituencies. They needed the support of the people to collect taxes or raise an army.
But under indirect rule, the British arrive and completely alter the power dynamic.
What do they tell the chiefs?
They tell them, you don't need to worry about what your people think anymore. You are backed by the British Crown and the British military. You answer only to the colonial governor now.
Wow.
In exchange, you collect taxes for us, and you requisition forced labor for our infrastructure projects.
So they took accountable leaders and turned them into unchecked tyrants overnight.
That's exactly what happened.
Imagine your local mayor, right? Imagine if tomorrow a foreign military rolled into your town, parked tanks outside City Hall, and told your mayor, "You're mayor for life now. We've got an army to protect you."
You never have to hold another town hall or election again.
Right. That mayor no longer needs your vote. They no longer care if your roads have potholes, if your schools have books, or if your local economy thrives. Their only incentive is to keep the foreign military happy.
That is the precise mechanism of institutional damage. Indirect rule froze political evolution in its tracks. It took systems that were actively developing natural checks and balances and turned them into rigid local despotisms.
The chiefs ceased to be representatives of their people and became extraction tools for the colonial state.
So the nations that were the most politically advanced suffered this permanent institutional brain damage. The very structures they built were used against them.
That is just, it's tragic. But that was type 1. The paper then moves to type 2 colonies, and this is where the story shifts from political manipulation to outright staggering physical theft.
Yes. Type 2 colonies are defined in the research as settler colonies.
Meaning?
These are places where the European powers decided they didn't just want to extract resources and rule from afar. They found the climate and geography agreeable, and they wanted to move in permanently.
So we're talking about places like South Africa, Zimbabwe, which was called Southern Rhodesia back then, and Kenya.
Exactly. In these regions, the colonial strategy wasn't just indirect rule, it was systematic dispossession. And this leads us to what we might call the hollowing out of the African economy.
The data we are about to look at here is chilling. I mean, institutional violence is often portrayed in history books as military conquest, battles, and guns.
Right.
But sometimes the most devastating violence is perpetrated by a bureaucrat with a spreadsheet and a property deed. How do the economists measure the exact violence of a stolen continent here?
By looking at the raw numbers of land allocation and applying standard economic theory. The data on settler colonies is just staggering. Let's look closely at South Africa. In 1913, the colonial government passed a piece of legislation called the Native Land Act. This single law legally allocated roughly 93% of the land to the white minority.
93%.
93%.
Leaving 7% of the land for the overwhelming vast majority of the black population.
And we should add, they didn't just take any land. They took the most fertile, resource-rich, agriculturally viable land, forcing millions into overcrowded, barren reserves.
Now, Heldring and Robinson use this historical fact to demonstrate a fundamental economic truth. To understand the true impact of this land theft, they apply a standard model called the Cobb-Douglas production function.
Yeah, the Cobb-Douglas function.
Let's break that formula down for a second, because it's crucial to understanding how poverty was engineered, not accidental. What exactly is this function?
It's a foundational formula in macroeconomics used to calculate the total output of an economy. It basically says that economic output is the result of combining labor, the workers, with capital, which in an agrarian society primarily means land.
So it calculates how much wealth a single worker can generate based on the resources they have access to.
Yes. If you are a farmer, your output, your wealth, is determined by your labor, meaning how many hours you work, multiplied by your land, meaning how many acres of fertile soil you have.
And crucially, the formula dictates the marginal product of labor, which is basically a fancy term for wages. How much is a worker's time worth?
Right, if a worker has plenty of rich land, their labor is highly productive and their wage is naturally high.
Okay, so let's plug the 1913 Native Land Act into this widely accepted economic formula. If you strip away 93% of the capital, the land, from the black workforce, the math dictates a mathematically unavoidable plunge in their standard of living.
Exactly. The models run by economists suggest that losing that much land would mathematically force a 59% drop in the standard of living for the dispossessed population.
A 59% drop. Their wealth was more than cut in half overnight by the stroke of a pen.
And we don't have to rely purely on theoretical math here. We have the historical wage data to back it up.
Oh.
Yeah. The paper cites seminal historical wage studies, including work by Francis Wilson in 1972, who looked at the real wages of black gold miners in South Africa.
What happened to their wages?
Following the Land Acts and the implementation of early color bar laws, which legally prevented black workers from holding skilled, higher-paying jobs, the real wages for black South Africans just crashed.
By how much?
The data shows black mining laborers experienced a 20% wage drop after 1911.
20%. And miners were considered almost a labor aristocracy at the time because they had formal cash-paying jobs.
hmm
What about the people who weren't in the mines?
It was worse in the rural areas. Data from researchers studying other settler colonies like Kenya and Zimbabwe suggests that real wages for Africans plummeted by as much as 50% in the decade after 1914.
Their living standards were literally halved.
Halved.
I want to frame this with an analogy to show how absurd the colonial narrative of progress really was. The colonizers would look at the booming economies of these settler colonies. They would point to the beautiful, modern, European-style cities being built in Cape Town or Nairobi, the high GDP of the commercial farms. And they would say, look at the civilization we've brought.
But it's a complete illusion built on extraction.
It's like someone kicking you out of your own highly successful, multi-generational family farm. They force you to live in a freezing, barren shed on the rocky edge of the property.
Right.
Then, because you are starving, you have no choice but to hire yourself out to the person who stole your farm. They pay you pennies to work the exact same fields you used to own. And when the farm reports record-breaking profits at the end of the year, the thief points to those profits as proof that they are developing the neighborhood and civilizing you.
Economists refer to the structure as a dual economy. You have a highly developed, wealthy, modern European economy floating on top of and actively extracting the life out of an artificially impoverished African economy.
So the poverty of the reserves wasn't natural at all.
No, it was a deliberate policy choice designed to force Africans into the wage labor market at rock-bottom prices.
Okay, but as we look at this data, we have to address a paradox. A massive contradiction that defenders of colonialism love to point to.
Oh, the health metrics.
Yes. If wages were dropping by 50% and people were being pushed into barren reserves, their land stolen. How do we explain the fact that African lifespans and physical health metrics actually increased during this exact same period?
This is a crucial point, and it's one of the most frequently cited defenses. The argument goes, yes, the economics were harsh, but we brought modern medicine, we built hospitals, and we increased life expectancy. We brought the gift of modern science.
And the data does show this, right?
It does. Reconstructions by demographic historians show that life expectancy slowly improved across many colonies during the 20th century. Anthropometric studies, which look at the physical height of people, often using military recruit records, show increases in average stature in places like Ghana and Kenya.
And taller people generally indicate better childhood nutrition and lower disease burdens.
Correct.
So how do we reconcile a 50% pay cut and land theft with growing taller and living longer? Were the colonial hospitals and vaccines an act of actual benevolence?
To understand the reality, we look at a concept known as the Troskin effect, named after economic historian Werner Troskin.
What did he study?
He originally studied this phenomenon in the context of the 19th century United States, specifically looking at why wealthy, enfranchised white populations in highly segregated cities would suddenly vote to invest heavily in public health infrastructure for poor, disenfranchised black neighborhoods.
Wait, why would they do that if they were actively enforcing segregation?
Because diseases do not respect segregation lines. A virus, or cholera, or yellow fever doesn't care if you're rich or poor. The white elites realized that if a massive epidemic took root in the artificially impoverished, overcrowded black neighborhoods with no sanitation, it was only a matter of time before it crossed the train tracks and infected the wealthy white neighborhoods.
Wow. It's the ultimate cynical investment. It's public health as a moat.
The exact same logic applied to the colonial administrators in Africa. We don't even have to guess that this was their motivation, because they literally wrote it down in their internal documents.
Did they really?
Yeah, the paper pulls a chilling quote from a 1944 colonial health report regarding Zimbabwe, then Southern Rhodesia.
What did the report say?
The white health officials explicitly stated that drastic and immediate action was needed regarding African health, not for humanitarian reasons, but because, and I'm quoting directly here, as we want to have a healthy white nation, we have got to tackle infectious diseases in the native. The native is the reservoir of these infectious diseases.
Oh my God.
Another official in a different context referred to medical interventions for Africans as mere self-protection.
The native is the reservoir. That language is so profoundly dehumanizing.
It completely shatters the myth of the benevolent colonizer bringing the gift of health.
Yeah.
They weren't building clinics out of empathy.
They were fumigating the warehouse to protect the inventory and the manager.
Exactly. They cured diseases to protect themselves and to ensure the labor force was physically capable of working in the mines and on the plantations. The secondary unavoidable effect was that African lifespans increased.
But if we tie that back to the wage data, the picture is incredibly bleak. They extended the timeline of suffering. You live longer, but you live poorer.
You have more years to work the stolen farm for pennies.
It really forces us to ask what development really means. Is it just a biological metric like a heartbeat continuing, an increase in physical height, or is it the quality, agency, and freedom of that life?
Which perfectly sets up the examination of their absolute favorite moral shield. The grand justification that was used to sell the entire European project in Africa to the public back home, the abolition of slavery.
The civilizing mission. The narrative goes like this. Yes, colonialism was harsh, and maybe we took some land, but we had to go in to stop the barbaric internal slave trade. The Arabs and the local empires were trading humans, and the enlightened Europeans arrived as saviors bringing freedom.
That was the propaganda heavily utilized by figures like King Leopold II of Belgium and various missionary societies to drum up public support for intervention.
But the Heldring and Robinson paper points out a massive hole in this story, a timeline issue that exposes the hypocrisy.
Yeah, a huge timeline issue.
If the European powers invaded Africa specifically to end the horrors of slavery, why did it take them half a century to actually ban it once they were completely in charge?
The abolitionist myth crumbles when you look at the actual legal timelines. Claiming to be a savior while actively allowing or even utilizing forced labor yourself is a staggering historical contradiction.
Let's look at the dates, because they are damning. The scramble for Africa officially kicks off in the 1880s following the Berlin Conference. The British take control of vast territories. But in Sierra Leone, a British colony, slavery wasn't fully legally outlawed until 1928.
In northern Nigeria, another major British holding, it wasn't officially banned until 1936.
1936. So they are sitting there for 50 years, watching slavery happen, profiting from the trade networks, and doing absolutely nothing to stop it.
Despite that being their stated moral justification for invading in the first place.
And we have to look at what replaced slavery even when it was legally banned.
Right, because the reality on the ground often didn't change much. The colonial government simply swapped traditional slavery for state-mandated forced labor.
What were those systems called?
In the French colonies, it was called the corvée system. In British territories like Rhodesia, it was the Chibaro system.
How did that work in practice?
The colonial states needed infrastructure, roads, railways, ports to extract the wealth. But they didn't want to pay market wages to attract workers. So they imposed arbitrary taxes on the local population, requiring payment in European currency, which Africans obviously didn't have.
So how do you get the currency?
The only way to get the currency was to sign a labor contract with the colonial state. If you refused, you were thrown in prison or your village was burned.
So hundreds of thousands of Africans were forced to build the very railroads that the Europeans bragged about as symbols of modernization.
Exactly. The message was basically, congratulations, you're not a slave anymore, but if you don't work on this railroad for free for 6 months out of the year, we'll burn your house down.
And the death tolls on those railway projects were astronomical.
Taking that a step further, let's return to our counterfactuals, our control groups. Did you actually need a European governor to abolish slavery? No. Look at uncolonized Thailand. They abolished slavery independently in 1915.
Uncolonized Iran abolished it in 1928.
Both of them abolished it before northern Nigeria did.
The global economy was shifting. The Industrial Revolution was changing the nature of labor worldwide, moving away from forced agricultural labor toward industrial wage labor.
Slavery was becoming economically obsolete and morally indefensible on a global scale. It was ending everywhere anyway. To credit colonialism with ending slavery in Africa is deeply misleading.
Okay, so we've looked at Type 1 colonies, where they corrupted the politically advanced, centralized states. We've looked at Type 2 settler colonies, where they hollowed out the economy and stole the land. Which brings us to the final category in the research.
The vast areas of Africa that lacked massive centralized states or major European settler populations. Type 3 colonies.
And this is where the colonial administrators introduced a completely different, incredibly lethal kind of poison into the social fabric.
We are talking about the forced puzzle and the engineering of genocide.
I want to ask a question that seems impossible on its face. How did a simple piece of paper, a bureaucratic colonial ID card, help engineer one of the bloodiest, fastest genocides in human history?
This gets to the heart of how colonial administration physically altered identity. In Type 3 colonies, the colonizers encountered uncentralized, diverse, or mixed societies.
Huh.
Remember that map at the 1885 Berlin Conference?
Yeah, the diplomats drawing straight lines across the continent with rulers.
Completely ignoring the complex existing geographical and cultural realities on the ground.
They forced completely unrelated, sometimes historically conflicting groups into arbitrary borders and declared them a single country.
It's like forcing strangers, or even active rivals, to live in a locked room together, tossing a single piece of bread inside and then acting surprised when they fight over it.
That isn't peacekeeping, it's engineering a slaughter.
And the most tragic, devastating example of how this arbitrary categorization played out is Rwanda.
The Rwandan genocide.
Now, the common misconception, the narrative often pushed in Western media when conflicts arise in Africa, is that the violence is due to ancient ethnic hatreds, that these tribes have just been fighting for 1,000 years because it's in their nature.
But the data and anthropological history say that's a myth.
It is entirely a myth. Let's look closely at pre-colonial Rwanda. The two main groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi, absolutely existed before European colonization. But the lines between them were fluid.
They share a common language, a shared religion, and lived side by side.
The distinction was often more about class or wealth specifically, cattle ownership within a system called ubuhike. If a Hutu acquired enough cattle and wealth, they could effectively transition and be recognized as Tutsi. There was social mobility.
So it wasn't a biological, rigid caste system. It was an economic class system.
Until the Europeans arrived. First the Germans and then the Belgians after World War I. They brought with them their 19th century European obsession with race science, phrenology, and eugenics.
Oh, no.
They looked at the Rwandan population, noted that the Tutsi tended to be slightly taller and have narrower noses due to differing historical diets and origins, and applied what is known as the Hamitic hypothesis.
What is that?
It was a racist pseudoscientific theory that claimed any advanced civilization in Africa must have been brought by a Caucasian-descended group from North Africa. The Belgians decided the Tutsi were a superior race, closer to Europeans.
So what did they do?
They systematically purged Hutus from any positions of leadership and made the Tutsi the exclusive ruling class, the enforcers of colonial extraction and forced labor.
And then came the administration, the ID cards.
Yes. In 1932, the Belgian colonial administration conducted a census and issued mandatory ethnic identity cards. Every person was legally defined permanently as Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa.
They literally sent out bureaucrats with calipers to measure people's nasal indexes and skull sizes to determine which category to stamp on their ID card.
They took a fluid social class and turned it into a hard, inescapable biological destiny stamped on a piece of government paper.
Now consider the structural dynamics. What happens when you create a system of extreme inequality, where one group is handed all the political power, all the educational opportunities, and the other group is subjected to forced labor and heavy taxation?
And you make it legally impossible for anyone to move between those groups. You plant the seeds of absolute structural hatred.
You build a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut.
And that pressure cooker eventually exploded.
Yeah.
Decades later, long after the Belgians had left, the resentment they engineered remained. The exact same colonial ID cards, introduced in 1932 to make administration easier for Brussels, were used by Hutu extremist militias in 1994 to identify and slaughter 800,000 Tutsis in 100 days at roadblocks.
The genocide cannot be separated from the colonial architecture that hardened those identities and institutionalized the division.
It just can't. And while Rwanda is the most extreme example, this forced puzzle happened everywhere. Look at Sierra Leone.
What happened there?
Sierra Leone is a textbook case of how corrupting local authority fuels long-term conflict. We were talked about indirect rule earlier. The British created paramount chiefs for life in the interior of Sierra Leone. Before local leadership was negotiated, the British completely perverted local democracy, creating a local despotism to rule the rural areas.
And this had consequences decades later.
Massive consequences. This systemic disenfranchisement of the rural youth, who had no say in their leadership and were heavily taxed by corrupt chiefs, directly fueled the gruesome 1991 Civil War.
The Revolutionary United Front rebels were, in large part, tapping into the deep anger against the corrupt chief system the British had installed and that the post-colonial government had maintained.
Or look at Ghana. They forced the proud, centralized Asante nation, who we discussed earlier, into a newly drawn border alongside rival coastal groups who had historically feared them.
As soon as independence hit, there was no natural social contract holding the country together. The whole nation dissolved into 25 years of post-independence coups, military rule, and chaos.
The colonizers creating nations that were structurally designed to fail. Which brings us to the great tragedy of the mid-20th century.
The moment of supposed triumph that turned into a nightmare.
Exactly.
Here is the great paradox of modern African history. It's a question that critics of Africa often ask. Why did so many African countries actually become poorer right after they finally won their freedom?
It's arguably the most heartbreaking part of the data. If you look at the GDP charts, after the massive wave of independence in the 1960s, you don't see a boom. You see a sharp, devastating decline across much of the continent.
By the year 2008, countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zimbabwe, and Burundi were actually poorer on a per capita basis than they were on the exact day they celebrated their independence.
So critics point to this economic freefall and say, see, when the Europeans left, the Africans couldn't govern themselves. Colonialism was the only thing holding it all together.
But the NBER paper argues that this is a profound misreading of what independence actually meant in structural terms.
The reality is that the colonizers physically left, yes. The British viceroys and French governors got on boats and sailed back to London or Paris.
But they left behind a fully operational state machinery that was designed entirely for violent extraction, not for governance.
Getting rid of a dictator doesn't help if the new president just moves into the dictator's office, sits at his desk, and uses his exact same rule book to run the country.
The paper relies on a brilliant concept developed by historian Frederick Cooper, the gatekeeper state.
You have to understand the physical and economic geography of the colonial system. It was never, ever designed to develop a domestic African economy.
Just look at a map of African railways built during the colonial era. They don't connect major African cities to each other to foster internal trade. They were just parallel lines running straight from the inland mines and agricultural centers directly to the coastal ports.
A pure extraction network.
Exactly. The colonial state sat at the gate, the port, and extracted wealth as it left the country. To maximize this extraction, they created bureaucratic institutions like marketing boards.
Let's explain marketing boards, because on the surface, cocoa marketing board sounds like a boring agricultural co-op.
But in practice, it was legalized systemic extortion.
Let's trace a crop. Say you were an African cocoa farmer in Ghana during the colonial era. You grow your crop, but you were legally forbidden from selling your cocoa on the open world market.
The colonial law dictates that you must sell your entire harvest to the state-run marketing board at a fixed, artificially dirt-cheap price set by the government.
The marketing board takes your cocoa, sells it on the global market in London or New York for a massive profit, and the colonial state keeps the difference.
It's a mechanism for siphoning the wealth generated by African labor directly into the state treasury.
Now, what happened at independence? Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana or Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe take power. They inherit these artificial countries with borders drawn by Europeans containing diverse ethnic groups with no shared social contract.
And crucially, they inherit these exact same states, these exact same marketing boards, this exact same extraction machinery.
It's like kicking a bank robber out of the vault, but then the new bank manager looks around and says, you know, this system of looting the safe is actually highly efficient. Let's keep the conveyor belt running, but put my political party in charge of the proceeds.
You cannot separate a modern dictator's authoritarianism from the blueprint left behind by the colonizers. Take Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. His brutal, suppressive regime cannot be understood without looking at the white minority regime of Ian Smith and Rhodesia that preceded him.
Mugabe inherited a state with no democratic checks and balances, a state designed only to extract wealth, control movement, and suppress dissent with police violence. He didn't dismantle the machine, he simply took the helm.
And because these artificial nations lacked a cohesive social contract, those new leaders used that extracted wealth to buy the loyalty of the military and suppress rival ethnic groups just to stay in power. The state became a prize to be captured.
Hence the post-independence economic freefall. The gatekeeper machine just kept eating the country from the inside out, only this time operated by local elites instead of foreign ones.
But to truly prove this theory, to prove that the colonial machinery was the root cause of the poverty and not some intrinsic flaw in African culture, we need a control group. We need to find one place where this machinery was never fully installed. Does that exist?
Yes. The Heldring and Robinson paper points to the ultimate proof, which is almost funny in a dark way. The greatest gift a European colonizer could possibly give an African nation was sheer, absolute total neglect.
Let's talk about Botswana, the sole surviving miracle.
During the colonial era, Botswana was a British protectorate known as Bechuanaland. But the British essentially did nothing there. They didn't find gold or diamonds right away. They looked at it, thought it was just a giant, unprofitable desert, and largely ignored it.
They provided no education, no health care, no infrastructure, absolute benign neglect.
Because they were ignored, the Tswana elites were able to preserve their pre-colonial institutions. Unlike the Asante and Ghana, who were warped by indirect rule and turned into despots, the Tswana leaders maintained their traditional mechanisms of political accountability.
The chiefs still had to answer to the people in public assemblies, which they called kagalas.
I read about the Kotla system. It was basically a massive town hall where anyone could speak freely, criticize the chief, and debate policy. They kept the social contract alive because the British didn't bother to destroy it.
So when independence finally came to Botswana in 1966, they weren't dealing with a warped, despotic power structure. They didn't have a hollowed-out gatekeeper state built for violent extraction.
They had a functioning, accountable society with a legitimate government under leaders like Seretse Khama.
And what was the economic result of dodging the colonial bullet?
Botswana experienced the fastest rate of economic growth in the world over the subsequent decades, faster than the Asian tigers. Shortly after independence, massive diamond reserves were discovered at Harappa.
In almost any other African country, that discovery would have fueled a civil war or been stolen by a dictator.
But because Botswana had accountable institutions, because the Kotla tradition survived, the wealth wasn't stolen. It was invested back into the country's infrastructure, education, and healthcare.
They succeeded despite colonialism, precisely because they experienced so little of it. It is the ultimate control group. The one country the Europeans forgot to civilize ended up being the most prosperous, stable, and democratic.
It entirely destroys the argument that European intervention was necessary for African modernization.
Evaluating the massive scope of the data, the final verdict of the Heldring and Robinson paper is devastating. When you aggregate all these mechanisms, the corruption of centralized states, the hollowing out of settler economies, the forced puzzles that ended in genocide, and the lingering ghost of the gatekeeper state,
The average effect of European colonialism on Africa is profoundly, indisputably negative.
they traded a microscopic fraction of technological infrastructure, a few railroads designed to steal minerals and some clinics designed to protect white administrators, for a century of political paralysis, engineered ethnic hatred, and systemic continent-wide theft.
The data leaves no room for the benevolent savior narrative.
I want to address you directly, the listener. Think about the world you live in today. Think about how easy it is to turn on the news, look at a struggling African nation experiencing a coup or extreme poverty, and subtly blame its culture. To think, why can't they just get it together?
How easy is it to ignore the historical handcuffs they were forced to wear? Handcuffs that were designed, quite literally and mathematically, to prevent them from getting it together.
The paper leaves us with a lingering, deeply unsettling question. Have we truly escaped the colonial era? The physical governors left, the uniforms are gone, the viceroys sailed home in the 1960s.
But look at global finance today. Look at the international debt traps holding African nations hostage, forcing them to export raw materials to pay off crippling interest to Western banks. Sound familiar?
Look at foreign tech companies extracting cobalt and rare earth minerals from the Democratic Republic of the Congo under horrific semi-slave conditions, just so we can power our smartphones and electric cars.
The uniforms disappeared. The rule books were swapped out for economic treaties and IMF structural adjustment programs. But is the invisible machinery of the 1885 scramble for Africa still running silently in the background of our modern world? The architecture of extraction remains remarkably intact.
The greatest heist in human history wasn't just about stealing gold or land. It was about stealing time, hijacking evolution, and rewriting the future of a continent. And as we look at the devices in our hands right now, we have to ask ourselves, is the heist still happening? Something for you to ponder until the next deep dive.